Did the Crusades fail? If your answer to that question is yes, then you don't understand the Crusades. Some believe that the Crusades were a series of military invasions of the Holy Land launched from Western Europe between 1095 and 1291. But they were much more. The campaigns in the Holy Land represent one small aspect of the Crusades only. The Crusades were not merely a series of wars. They were a social movement, a paradigm shift, an attitude. They were a worldview adopted by Western Europeans, and that worldview saved them from being completely subjugated by Islam. Prior to the Crusades, Western Europe was a collection of partially Christianized competing tribal kingdoms. The Crusades changed that dramatically. The Crusades remade Europe into something very new and very formidable: Christendom. So how did it happen? Well, it didn't begin with Western Europe at all. It began in the distant East with a powerful conquering force. In the 7th century AD, the Arabs swept out of their homeland. They waged warfare on the Christian world and conquered around 2/3 of it. Ancient, culturally rich Christian territories, such as Egypt, Libya, Syria, the Holy Land, and Spain, fell to the Islamic armies. This had a powerful psychological impact on the Christian world. Western Europe was penned in by a new religious empire. There wasn't much that Europeans could do about it for the first few hundred years, since they didn't have the wealth to launch a major offensive against Islam. Fast forward to the turn of the 11th century. Something began to change in Western Europe. Like all great movements, the Crusades began with an idea conceived by the Christian Church of the West. Up until then, warfare in Europe had been largely internalized, with competing noble families fighting each other for political dominance. But some churchmen began to imagine a new type of warfare, as well as a new type of warrior. What if war was no longer about petty internal squabbles? What if it had a higher purpose that served all of Christianity and all of Christians? What if it could be directed against the enemies of Christ with the aim of safeguarding the territory where Christians lived? This was the beginning of the conception of the Crusades. In the 11th century, the popes began consecrating the military efforts of Spanish Christians against Muslims as holy enterprises. They also called on the Normans to invade Muslim-held Italy and Sicily. It worked. These Christian armies began to reclaim territory once lost to the Muslims. This all set the stage for an even bigger event, which took place in the last 5 years of the 11th century, the First Crusade. Here's how Pope Urban II addressed the knights when he was preaching the First Crusade. "Let those who are accustomed to wage private wars wastefully, even against believers, go forth against the infidels in a battle worthy to be undertaken now and to be finished in victory. Now let those who until recently existed as plunderers be soldiers of Christ. Now let those who formerly contended against brothers and relations rightly fight barbarians." The First Crusade achieved something remarkable. It united Western Europeans from all corners of their continent: England, France, Spain, Germany, Italy, and more. Warriors who previously had no connection were suddenly bound together, united in a single super army with the united goal of defending their common heritage and religion against an external alien aggressor. And they weren't fighting close to home either. They traveled huge distances from Europe to Asia to take on Muslim armies in Anatolia, Syria, and Palestine. Today, armies traveling across continents is commonplace, but it was highly unusual in the 11th century and represented a massive risk. Amazingly, the First Crusade succeeded. This diverse, motley army of warriors from all over Europe managed to achieve a united goal of defeating Islamic forces and restoring formerly Christian cities like Antioch and Jerusalem to Christian rule. It's impossible to overestimate the impact that the victory of the First Crusade had on Western European culture. For one thing, it essentially gave birth to a common Western heritage. For the first time, Westerners had a common experience upon which they could reflect, and it was remembered everywhere. Churches were built commemorating this event. Chronicles were written to immortalize the experience. Songs were composed, statues built, stained glass windows were dedicated. Everywhere, people recalled their relatives who had been involved and revered their memory. Guibert of Nogent, one of the most famous authors from this period, interpreted the First Crusade as a paradigm shift. He describes here how God gave crusading to warriors as an alternative to the monastic life, so that they might achieve God's purposes through their customary profession. God ordained holy wars in our time so that the knightly order and the erring mob who, like their ancient pagan models, were engaged in mutual slaughter, might find a new way of earning salvation. Thus, without having chosen a monastic life, they were compelled to give up this world, free to continue their customary pursuits. Nevertheless, they earned some measure of God's grace by their own efforts. Therefore, we have seen nations, inspired by God, shut the doors of their hearts towards all kinds of needs and feelings, taking up exile beyond the Latin world, beyond the known limits of the entire world, in order to destroy the enemies of the name of Christ, with an eagerness greater than we have seen anyone show in hurrying to the banquet table or in celebrating a holiday. Today, we interpret the First Crusade as a natural event, but for medieval Westerners, only the supernatural could explain it. This was God's work, and the success proved to them that it had been God's will. They now had evidence that God desired this thing called Christendom, this united militant civilization which spanned Europe and protected the Christian religion and way of life. The crusade became the most solemn duty of Christendom, and it wasn't confined to just operations in the Holy Land. Popes issued crusade indulgences for the wars in Spain against Islam, for the campaigns in the Baltic against pagans, and for the wars in southern France to drive out the Albigensians. The crusade became the means of protecting and expanding the common heritage of all Western European Christians on every front. At the end of the 13th century, the Muslims did drive the Crusaders out of the Holy Land, but that didn't mean they won the war. The Muslims continued on, trying to conquer the Christians farther in the west. They would ultimately gain Greece, Hungary, and other eastern regions. Indeed, the threat of the Ottoman Empire was far graver than what the Crusaders faced in the High Middle Ages. And it was the concept of the crusade that allowed Europeans, still frequently divided by internal politics, to band together through a common cause and preserve the West from complete takeover by the Ottoman Turks. Western Europe would ultimately defeat the Turks at Lepanto with a great crusade in the same tradition as the First Crusade, a united coalition of diverse Western European peoples intent on defending their tradition. In the case of Lepanto, that was the final verdict on Islam's designs on Western Europe, and that verdict was a successfully defended Christendom. Italy would not be conquered by the Muslims, but would remain a powerful Christian political entity. In Spain, too, the Muslims would be driven out, and the Spain that emerged victorious from its long war with Islam was very different from the Spain that had been conquered by the Muslims. That difference was Spain had been transformed into a part of Christendom, a self-consciously Latin Christian region which had used the crusade to defend its interests. Faced with the mentality of the crusade, Islam could not advance into Western Europe. Without the institution of the crusade, one wonders, how could Europe have stood against the increasing power of the Turks? The Ottoman Empire, so overwhelmingly huge, could have easily picked off the European countries, one by one. But by uniting as crusaders, the Europeans halted the Ottomans. Had it not been for crusading, Europe would likely have been completely captured by Islam. Had the Crusades not taken place, we would have only one civilization in Europe and Western Asia, Islam.